Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping right in today because there's been a pretty significant development for Canada's energy future, especially right after Prime Minister Mark Carney's election.
Yeah, a letter just dropped. Signed by what, 38 Canadian energy CEOs?
That's right, 38, and it's a public letter making some, well, pretty bold requests directly to the new PM.
Exactly. It's not just a congrats on the win note. They're really laying out specific policy changes they see as, well, crucial.
Crucial for the energy sector, obviously, but they're framing it as crucial for Canada hitting, strong economic growth under Carney.
Right. So our mission today is basically to unpack that. What exactly are they asking for? And what's their reasoning behind it? Give you a clear picture.
Okay, so let's get to the core of it. The letter really calls for two major policy changes. First, getting rid of the planned emissions cap for oil and gas producers.
And second, repealing the federal industrial carbon pricing system. That's the output-based pricing system, or OBPS.
Yeah, exactly. And they directly tie these changes to helping Carney achieve his goal of building the fastest growing G7 economy.
It's quite direct. They're essentially saying, look, the energy sector is a massive economic engine.
With significant untapped potential. I think that was the phrase they used.
Right. And that these current or proposed policies are basically holding it back, hindering investment, making Canada less competitive globally.
They really emphasize that economic argument. There's this line about the layering and complexity of energy policies over the last decade.
Yeah, I saw that. Leading to a lack of investor confidence. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. They seem genuinely worried that the current regulatory environment is just, well, too much of a barrier for attracting capital.
Okay, so let's dig into those specific policies they don't like. First, that emissions cap.
Right. So the federal plan, as it stands, is to make upstream oil and gas cut emissions 35% below 2019 levels sometime between 2030 and 2032.
And the CEO's take.
They argue it creates uncertainty. They call it redundant. They say it'll limit growth, force production cuts unnecessarily, and stifle investment in infrastructure.
Which is interesting because, as you mentioned, Carney himself had indicated before the election that he wasn't planning to scrap that cap.
Yeah, so there's a potential clash there right away. They believe this specific cap mechanism is just sort of counterproductive for them.
Okay. Then what about the second big ask, the industrial carbon pricing?
Right. So they want to scrap the federal system, the OBPS, and go back to a system where provinces manage their own carbon policies and pricing for industry.
Which also contrasts with Carney's campaign talk, right? He promised to strengthen carbon pricing overall, even after scrapping the consumer carbon price.
Exactly. The CEOs argue the current federal approach puts uncompetitive costs on them compared to international rivals who might not face similar pricing.
So it's really about that competitiveness angle again. They feel the federal backstop makes it harder to compete globally. They want maybe more tailored provincial systems?
Seems like it. More provincial autonomy, potentially leading to, different effective carbon costs across Canada depending on the province.
It really highlights that ongoing tension, doesn't it? How do you price carbon effectively without hurting your own industries on the world stage?
Definitely. And they didn't stop there. Those were the main points. They also mentioned wanting changes to the Impact Assessment Act.
Ah, yes, the one that governs reviews for major projects.
And the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act on parts of the BC coast.
Which, again, ties back to Carney's campaign promise of a one project, one review system. So they're pushing on that door too.
It all points towards wanting a, simpler, more predictable regulatory road for big energy projects, streamlining things.
So what's their alternative vision then? If they scrap these things, what do they propose instead?
Well, they talk about simplifying the whole regulatory regime, creating an attractive fiscal environment, which usually means taxes and royalties, and ensuring carbon policies actively protect export industries.
Okay. And their argument is that this approach, this simplification and focus on competitiveness, would actually drive more investment into reducing emissions.
That's the pitch, yeah. That a healthier, more confident industry will invest more in clean tech and emissions reduction itself, rather than being forced by specific caps or pricing mechanisms they see as harmful.
Interesting. So it's a different path to the same goal, potentially, or at least that's how they frame it.
Right. So just to sum it up for everyone listening, we've got these 38 energy CEOs basically saying to the new Prime Minister, to boost the economy and our industry, you need to roll back the emissions cap plans and the federal industrial carbon price.
They want significant shifts in federal energy and climate policy, arguing it's key for investment, competitiveness, and ultimately economic growth.
And that really leaves us and you with a big question, doesn't it?
It does. When you weigh the CEO's economic and competitiveness arguments against the government's stated climate targets and existing policy tools, what do you think is the most viable path forward for Canada's energy sector?
Yeah, it's a complex balance. Definitely something to think about.